Them around the world, places like Okinawa, Vieques, Hawaii, of course, the Philippines back in the days of Subic Bay, Guam, where the military basically runs roughshod over the local populations.
It's true, and there are more than 20 cases in which the U.S. military has displaced local people, often indigenous people like the Chagosians, as part of the creation or expansion of U.S. military bases around the world. And that's just since the end of the 19th century. Of course, during the 18th and 19th centuries, the U.S. Army in particular displaced millions of Native American peoples across the North American continent as part of the colonization and conquest of the continent. The Chagosians are not alone, but there is another case that is sadly telling. In 1946, in islands that the U.S. Navy occupied, the Ogasawara Islands, small islands that are now part of Japan, the U.S. Navy actually assisted a local population, mostly white local population of U.S. ancestry, in returning to their homes to live side by side with what was then a U.S. Navy base. They assisted in setting up schools. They assisted in setting up local government. They assisted in setting up a local economy. If the U.S. Navy, if the U.S. military, if the U.S. government can help a mostly white population of U.S. ancestry return to their homeland, their homes in 1946, surely the U.S. military, the Biden administration, can do the same for the Chagosians, a population of mostly African and Indian ancestry, return to their homes, their homeland, the land of their ancestors today.
We just have a minute, but Olivier Bancolt, your message to people here in the United States, as well as around the world.
My message on behalf of my people is to find out the way. We want, as all human beings, to be able to live in peace and harmony. As I said, that it's clear in mentioned in the International Universal Declaration of Human Rights that everyone has the right to live on his birthplace. We want our right to be recognized. We want that we can pay tribute to all our parents who are buried in Chagos, which we did not have access to the grave. I just give you one example. We, as Chagosian, we are not allowed to go to Chagos to pay tribute to our parents buried there. While in Point Cano, in Cannon Point, in Diego Garcia, we have a military dog cemetery who are well maintained. How would you consider that? My message to the world, we are not asking less or more. We are asking about our rights, and we want the Biden administration to apologize and to make reparation for what they did wrong to our people. And this is our message, and we want to have more awareness, ask people to give us more support on our action.
Olivier Bancolt, I want to thank you for being with us, chair of the Chagos Refugees Group, and David Vine, professor at American University, author of Island of Shame, The Secret History of the U.S. Military on Diego Garcia. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to New Mexico, where a Trump supporter wearing a MAGA hat opened fire on an indigenous-led protest against the reinstallation of a statue honoring a 16th century Spanish conquistador. One indigenous climate activist was shot and needed to be airlifted for emergency surgery. We'll speak to one of the indigenous activists who he waved a gun at, but didn't shoot or kill. Stay with us. Music by Chagosian musician Charlicia Alexis, one of the founders of the Chagos refugee group. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. In New Mexico, a 23-year-old white supporter of Donald Trump has been charged with attempted murder for shooting an indigenous activist last week during a protest over the reinstallation of a statue of the violent Spanish conquistador Juan de Oñate. The shooting occurred in the city of Española, New Mexico. The gunman, who was wearing a red MAGA hat, opened fire and shot Jacob Johns, who had to be airlifted to a hospital in Albuquerque for emergency surgery. Johns is an indigenous activist, muralist, artist, and father. In 2 months, he's planning to lead the Indigenous Wisdom Keepers delegation at the UN Climate Summit in Dubai, COP28, to advocate for indigenous solutions to climate change. A GoFundMe collection to help with his medical expenses has already raised over $200,000. The shooting occurred while he and other indigenous activists were protesting plans to reinstall a statue honoring the 16th century conquistador Juan de Oñate, New Mexico's first colonial governor, who in 1599 ordered a massacre that killed between 800 and 1,000 Acoma indigenous people. 3 years ago, in June 2020, a former Albuquerque city council candidate was arrested for shooting a protester 4 times at a demonstration calling for the removal of another Juan de Oñate statue. Local and state officials in New Mexico reportedly ignored warnings of potential gun violence ahead of Thursday's indigenous-led peaceful action in Española. This is Melanie Yazzie of the Red Nation.
Denise Williams, mother of shooting victim Scott Williams, who was targeted at a 2020 Oñate protest in Albuquerque, said prior to Thursday's event, she called Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's office, the office of U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich, New Mexico State Police, the office of the New Mexico Attorney General, all members of U.S. Congress representing Valencia County in New Mexico, and all New Mexico State representatives and senators from Valencia County, to warn them of the high chance of gun violence directed at attendees. State Senator Elizabeth Stefanik was the only one to respond. Immediately after the shooting, Scott Williams' father, Dan Williams, called the governor's office again to tell her that she, quote, had blood on her hands for failing to properly respond to and prevent both shootings.
During Thursday's protest in Española, New Mexico, the gunman also pointed a gun at Malaya Pechino, who joins us now from Albuquerque. Malaya, I know you are still suffering from the shock of what happened, the shooting of the indigenous activist and the gunman waving his gun at you and others. Can you talk about your experience, what happened then, and why you were all there in that peaceful action?
Yeah, absolutely. I just first want to say good morning. My experience, well, I'll start with why we were there. They proposed to put up this statue, and there was a budget, a certain amount of money allotted. And I didn't feel it was right for our community money that could be spent on resources and support and our healing of our community to be spent on this statue. And so Thursday wasn't a protest. Thursday was a sunrise ceremony in the morning time, and it was a celebration. We came together and we prayed and we celebrated as a family that we were able to postpone this statue.
And Malaya, could you talk about who was proposing to install this statue, given the horrific history of Juan de Oñate? In fact, he was, if you could tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about his legacy, he was so cruel that even the Spanish government, colonial government at the time, put him on trial, and they were obviously extremely cruel toward the native populations. And but even they considered had gone beyond the pale.
Sorry, the feed that I'm getting is cutting in and out a little bit, so I didn't hear the whole question. But I heard you mention, you asked me about Oñate and who he was as a man.
Yes.
And that's a really interesting question. And it brings up a lot of controversy in our community because on one hand, there are the people whose ancestors and whose history was that violence that he committed and was brought from that pain, you know, of him and the suffering that he put our indigenous peoples through. And that's one side of it. And then on the other side of it, you know, we have Spanish people in our community, part of our valley, who he was their ancestry and he was what they feel pride in, you know. And so there is a lot of division going on in our community, and it is a really controversial thing to talk about Oñate. And I think for me, you know, as important as it is to recognize his violence and how much he hurt people, it was less about him as a man and more about the fact that I see pain and suffering in our community, and I see how some funds for the missing and murdered Indigenous women, some funds for our alarming rates of overdoses, our housing crisis, that feels more important than funding a statue being resurrected.
And the response of Governor Lujan to calls for her to be aware that there was possible violence, how do you feel she responded in this situation?
You know, I haven't really, after the incident, I've just been with family, so I haven't been looking at politicians' responses to the incident, but I do feel that they had a duty to protect us, you know. From the morning time, the shooter was there, and he was watching us, and it was brought to the attention of the police that people felt uncomfortable with him there. And so they had a duty to protect us, and it's my personal opinion that they did not do that. That when you see a rally of people and then you see an opposing side starting to form, that's you show up, and they didn't show up for us. So that's what I have to say about that.
Malaya, you're 23. Apparently, this white gunman who shot Johns is 23 as well. I wanted to turn to the Palestinian activist Mohammed El-Kurd, who spoke at the rally only 15 minutes before Jacob Johns was shot.
I am so disgusted by the people here who have nothing better to do, whose lives are so empty that they have nothing better to do than to celebrate the legacy of a murderous war criminal. Life could be so much better. You could build a much better legacy. You could wash your hands off this blood. And yet you decide to do this. Not only should these statues come down, but all land must be given back.
Soon after Mohammed El-Kurd spoke, 15 minutes later, the gunman shot Jacob Johns. Malaya, you're still coping with the violence against all of you. Your response to him being charged with, what was it, attempted murder, and of the whole community right now, as there was such, as we just heard before, such knowledge of the possible threats of gun violence against your action. Malaya.
Sorry, the ending cut out just a little bit.
If you could respond to the charges, he's being charged, the gunman, with attempted murder. And also, if you could tell us how Jacob Johns is doing and how you're doing, because you all experienced both his shooting and the threatened shooting of you and others.
You know, that's a really good question. I thank you for checking in on how we're all doing. It means a lot. I think that his charge for attempted first-degree murder and aggravated assault because he pointed the gun at me, I think that's fair.